Okay, I think that's us, and we are ready to go. Okay, let's go. Today we're going to go over the Woodland Creation Maintenance grant. We're going to just talk about what the grant itself covers. We're going to cover the application process. Becky's then going to pick up the reins and run through how the grant relates to the basic payment scheme. And then finally we'll just close on the aspects of agreement management and how claims are managed. So that's our plan. We've got about 10 or 12 slides to run through, so hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end. Okay, so the Creation Maintenance Grant, what is it? It's coded WD1 in the Sunshine Stewardship codes, and it's a 10-year grant that supports the successful establishment of new woodlands. So that's the aim of it. It's there to provide support to the ongoing maintenance needed to secure a new woodland after 10 years. It is part of the higher tier of countryside stewardship, if you're familiar with that. So it falls into that category, but it has just the one option, WD1, for the maintenance payments. I guess the thing about the key point about it being in the higher tier is that the higher tier terms and conditions apply as do the mandatory sections of the higher tier manual. So worth bearing in mind that applies rather than the Woodland Creation Grant. Agreements, like the other higher tier agreements, start on the 1st of January following the year of the application. And it's only available where you have a countryside stewardship capital agreement for woodland creation and you've submitted the final capital claim. So you've got to have completed all of your planting before you apply for the WD1 option. So the grant itself, it's a payment, an annual payment or a multi-annual payment of £200 per hectare per year for 10 years. And as we just sort of talked through, it's to cover the maintenance or support the maintenance work required to establish a new woodland. So what that covers is the weeding that might be needed, the beating up of the trees, so replacement of any losses, the maintenance of any fences or individual tree protection that have been put on to the site. Any clearing of woody weeds you might need to do or to prepare the site, help keep it weed free. Maintenance of open space where that's part of the woodland design. And then finally the removal of any individual tree protection measures for year 10. So that's what the payment covers. And you can find out more about this. There's a link there down at the bottom in the item guide for the WD1 option. Okay, so as with other CS grant items and options, there are some requirements that agreement holders need to comply with. And these are for WD1 to provide photos of the site every 2 years to confirm that it's being maintained and it's developing and becoming established woodland. A self-certificate checklist in years 4, 7 and 10 that confirms that all the necessary operations have been carried out. And those two things will need to be submitted with the appropriate claim each year. Well, not each year, sorry, let me rephrase that. So when in the appropriate year, when you claim, you need to support that claim with your photo evidence and self-certification checklist. We will be developing a template checklist for self-certification that won't be sort of mandatory to use, but hopefully will give agreement holders an idea of what they need to be doing and submitting when they make their claims. So, if I'm honest, we're yet to hit year 4, so that's something we need to get in place and make available shortly. In addition to that, agreement holders are asked to keep hold of bank statements, receipted invoices and copies of consents or permissions connected to the work, and in general sort of just records of management activity on the land that's under the agreement. And those may be, we may need you to supply those on request. So overall, we sort of recommend keeping a sort of a record of the evidence throughout the agreement to keep on top of what's needed. I think the other point to just say is if you're sort of hit by unexpected maintenance problems, it's worth contacting your woodland officer to discuss them and how to sort of move forward. So sort of try and keep that dialogue open with woodland officers if you sort of hit unexpected problems. So who's eligible to apply for WD1? Okay, so you need to, well, the land can't be in an existing multi-annual agreement, so the land itself can't be subject to, for example, environmental stewardship. Now that check would have been undertaken when the capital application was submitted for the Woodland Creation Grant. That would have been subject to a sort of a test to try and essentially work out where whether the change to woodland from that multi-annual agreement was appropriate for the land. So so that shouldn't be an issue, but it's worth bearing in mind that you can't have WD1 on top of existing multi-annual agreements. That also means that land in WD1 is not eligible for WD2, which is another higher tier option for the management of established woodland. So Becky's going to talk about how the grant scheme links up with the basic payment scheme later. So essentially, there are only 2 BPS codes where WD1 can be claimed. There are only two where there's a sort of a compatibility that BPS compatibility is allowed. So it's important that the BPS land use is up to date. We'll talk about that later. The WD1 grant isn't available to public authorities, and that's really to do with some rules, EU rules around requirements that exist on public authorities to maintain their property and to try and sort of avoid sort of double payment of grants or taxes to support the management of public land. And then the other point to make is, as I mentioned before, you need to have made your final claim for the Woodland Creation Capital Grant. So we have to have had that, and we'll talk about the timescales for that in a moment. But that's really just to confirm that the original sort of objectives for the Woodland Creation are being met. Okay, the timeline for applications. So to be invited to apply this year, we would need to have your final capital Woodland Creation Grant claim by the end of March. Then between mid-April and mid-May, we will issue an application pack for those agreement holders that have submitted that final claim in time. Again, on the 15th of May, again, just a reminder that by this time, if you are claiming BPS on your WD1 land, the BPS land use will need to be one of the two compatible options for your WD1 application to be able to proceed. And again, we'll touch on that in a bit more detail in a moment. But essentially, the land use, we would say, please change the land use at the time you get your Woodland Creation Capital Grant Agreement. So hopefully your land use will be up to date by the time you are invited to apply for the WD1. The deadline to return your application to Natural England's Countryside Services delivery teams is the end of June, and then the agreement would start on the 1st of January 2019. Okay, so the practicalities of actually how to apply. Your application needs to include the application form itself, the supporting annex, which we'll talk about in a minute, but that sort of sets out the land that's being put forward, and it needs to have an application map that needs to meet the minimum standard. The Annex 5, you declare the land that you want to bring into the WD1 option, and we'll look at an example of that in a moment. But in effect, the area should match the area that's in your Woodland Creation Capital Grant Agreement. As I said, the map needs to meet a minimum standard, and you can find out details of that in the Woodland Creation Grant Manual and also in the higher tier manual, both of which are published on gov.uk. But in essence, the map needs to show the area of WD1. It should mark out areas of open ground that are going to be maintained as open ground as sort of part of the woodland design. And it needs to be labelled with the applicant's single business identifier in the top right and the name of the applicant. And once you've done that, the applications go to Countryside Stewardship Delivery Services in Crewe. So this slide, just a bit more detail on the Annex 5 that you need to complete. It's in two parts. The first part isn't shown here, but that's sort of an overview of the application details. And then part 2 is really where you talk about the land that you're bringing forward into the WD1. So essentially you need to list the land parcels that are going to come under that option. As I say, they should sort of match with the areas that have been awarded grants under the Woodland Creation Capital Grant. And then you need to sort of calculate the total area that's going into the WD1 option. Also, just confirm whether you intend to claim BPS on that land. And as I've alluded to, that will be subject to checks against the BPS land use, and we'll touch on that in a moment. So hopefully a fairly straightforward application form to work through just to confirm which land parcels are coming forward to that WD1 option. And then following sort of the recent restructuring of what was Natural England's technical services teams, the WD1 application should be directed to the VS Delivery Services team in Crewe, and they will do the processing there. Okay. now we're going to sort of move on to a few slides just to try and to explain in a bit more detail about the interaction between the Woodland Creation Maintenance Grant and Basic Payment Scheme. Becky, are you okay to pick up now? Run through the last slide?
Yep, I will do. Thanks, Alec. So yes, as Alex said, I'm just going to, for the next few slides, talk about the relationship between the Basic Payment Scheme and this particular grant. So the first thing that I would like to do is to just advise all applicants to read and follow the steps that are outlined in the Forestry Commission's Operation Note 42, which was recently published, and it's available on forestry.gov.uk. The operations note essentially outlines everything that I'm going to run through today in a lot more detail, so I do recommend that you get hold of a copy after this webinar. So just to summarize then the key messages. So land in a Woodland Creation Agreement and a Woodland Creation Maintenance Agreement is non-agricultural, but you may still be eligible to apply for BPS throughout the lifetime of the Creation Maintenance Agreement, regardless of the fact that it's considered non-agricultural. So non-agricultural land is considered eligible for BPS where both of these criteria are met. So firstly, the land must have been used with entitlements to claim under SBS in 2008. And secondly, the land must be in an eligible rural development program scheme. So for countryside stewardship, the two schemes that are eligible in this instance are Woodland Creation and Woodland Creation Maintenance. So moving on to the next slide. Before applying, there's a couple of things that applicants need to bear in mind and need to carry out before they submit their application. So the first thing is that all applicants must notify the RPA of this area of non-agricultural land using an RLE1 form and a sketch map to update the land cover of that area to woodland, and if required, to delineate the areas of new planting. So I'll talk a little bit about the timings of doing that in a later slide. The second thing applies to applicants who also claim BPS. So you need to use the correct land use code in your BPS application. The appropriate land use codes will be explained in a bit more detail on the following slide, but the key thing really here to note is that land cover and land use are different things, and they both need to be updated prior to applying for Woodland Creation Maintenance if you claim BPS and if you don't claim BPS. So for woodland applicants who don't claim BPS, you need to ensure that that land cover is updated prior to applying. And then you also need to just authorize Natural England to update the land use code that they see on City Agri, the system that processes the applications, so that we can process your application through the system. So the BPS handbook will be updated for 2018, and the RLE1 form guidance is also undergoing review. So I recommend keeping an eye out for them on gov.uk. They should both be updated in the next couple of weeks. So just moving then on to land use codes. So as Alex mentioned earlier, there's two codes that are compatible with this grant. So the first one is WO12 and the second one is RD01. If the land in your creation maintenance application is not covered by a compatible code, your application unfortunately cannot be processed. So agreement holders who claim BPS on their land holding need to include all the land that's in a woodland agreement on your BPS application. If the land's not eligible to receive BPS, then you use the code WO12 in your BPS application. And if it is eligible, then you use the code RD01. However, both of these land use codes need to be supported by a woodland land cover, which is why we recommend that you update your land cover using an RLE1 form as your first step. At the end of that 10-year agreement, the woodland becomes a permanent land use change and it's no longer eligible to claim BPS. So after 10 years of your Woodland Creation Maintenance Agreement, if you continue to claim BPS, you need to declare that area in your BPS application form as WO12, and you'll no longer be able to receive BPS on that area. So moving on to how do you actually update your land use code. So it's really crucial that your BPS claim reflects the actual land use at the time of submitting your BPS application. So I cannot stress enough the advice that's in Operations Note 42. It talks about date of establishment that you need to use to notify the RPA, and it just talks about all the different ways that you need to update your land cover and your land use. So I highly recommend getting hold of a copy as soon as you've watched this webinar. It's really important to note that if you use an incorrect code on your BPS application, that could lead to a risk of penalty. And also, as I mentioned earlier, if you don't have the correct code applied to the area that you're putting in your Woodland Creation Maintenance application, we won't be able to process it. So as Alec mentioned earlier, the land use and land cover should really be updated in your Woodland Creation Agreement. That's because from the commencement of your creation agreement, the land is considered non-agricultural, regardless of when the trees are planted. That's because it's been set aside for non-agricultural use. So agreement holders need to submit that RLE1 form to notify the RPA, and the operations note talks about the start date that you need to note down in your RLE1 form. If the agreement holder then also claims BPS, they need to update the land use code in the following BPS application to either RD01 if they're eligible or W12. So you need to do these actions before you apply for creation maintenance, otherwise your application won't be successful. And then just the final slide today is just a little bit on agreement management. So as Alec mentioned earlier, this is a higher tier grant. So agreement holders are required to comply with the mandatory elements that are set out in the higher tier manual. So that's chapters 3, 6, and 7, and annexes 6 and 8. The manual is available on gov.uk at the moment. And then just a bit of information on claims. All multi-annual claims should be submitted to Natural England by the middle of May every year. And we suggest that you refer to Chapter 7 of the Higher Tier Manual, which outlines the dates. And if you have any queries about your claim, to contact Natural England, and their contact details are provided at the back of the Higher Tier Manual. So that's everything from me. So we'll just pause to take any questions at the moment.
Okay, thanks, Becky. There's just one question come through on the text, which asks, can you claim WD1 if only part of the Woodland Creation Capital Grant has been completed and claimed? I'm afraid not. You need to have completed all of your creation capital works and made your final claim under that agreement before you'd be invited to come into the WD1 grant. I've also been reminded just to encourage where possible that applications are made by email. Yeah, where you can, if you can, please submit your applications to the Delivery Services team in Crewe by email. Okay, we'll just pause a minute more just in case there are some more questions to come through when you're grappling with the text function. There's nothing coming through. There might be someone who's just thinking about a question. Okay, that's come through.
We've got one question which I think is in relation to claims. So just to expand on that a little bit, you need to submit a claim form either online or get in touch with the Natural England office if you have any problems being able to submit a claim online.
Okay, and I'm just reading that myself now, and if that question's around the application forms for the grant, the application forms are sent out when we get the, as I say, between mid-April, mid-May, we will sort of invite applications to do that. As part of that process, we will send out the application forms to the WD1 grant. Okay, there's no other questions at the moment. I think I will just sort of let the webinar run for sort of 5 minutes longer in case you're sort of thinking about things and you do want to submit a question. So I'll leave the webinar running. But otherwise, hopefully you found that helpful, sort of an overview of the grant and a bit more detail on how it fits together with the basic payment scheme. And yes, I'll sort of end things on that. Thank you very much for making the time to dial in, and yeah, hopefully we look forward to your applications in due course. Okay, thanks all.